So, hello and welcome to another episode of our podcast where we're looking at the interaction between housing issue salience and people's propensity to vote for incumbent parties, how the housing crisis affects young people and their relationship to politics. And today, our guest is David Farrell. If you want to give us a little bit of an introduction to who you are, what your work is.
Yeah, sure. Adam, thanks for the invitation to talk to you. I'm a professor of politics at University College Dublin, where I've been now for, the last 16 years. Before then, I spent 2 decades working in the UK at the University of Manchester. So really, it's in the last 16 years that my work has come back to more of a focus on Irish politics. I have had some involvement in trying to help support the election studies research in Ireland, because as you'll know, for a long time there was no funding given to support a national election study. So I was part of a small group that were coordinating to try and beg, borrow or steal whatever funds we could get to support some sort of rudimentary election studies in 2011, 2016 and 2020. So my current research really is focused mostly on electoral systems, interest still in parties and political parties and party politics, and deliberative mini-publics.
Fantastic. So I guess you mentioned, yeah, that you're looking into the different electoral systems that we have, and especially the case that we have here in Ireland. So maybe you could give us a little bit of a background into what is the voting system that we use in Ireland, and how does our electoral system kind of compare to the European examples? Is Ireland a little bit of a divergent case in some examples, or is it quite a typical representative democracy? What's your kind of view on that?
Yeah, I mean, we have a proportional representation system. So we're like the bulk of Europe's democracies in having a PR electoral system, but we have a really unusual one. I know you know this, Adam, but we use a version called the single transferable vote, which was invented by an Englishman, Thomas Hare, in the 1880s. And what effectively happened is that in the early 1900s, as democracy was beginning to develop in these first wave democracies, of which Europe is a prime region for this. Whereas most of Europe's democracies decided to, test and explore the options of different kinds of proportional representation systems. And in almost all cases, they went for list systems. The British instead decided to experiment on their colonies. So Ireland and Malta in particular, both colonies in the early 90s of the UK, were encouraged, forced in the case of Malta, to adopt the single transferable vote. And both of those countries to this day retain this particularly unusual electoral system. So other than Ireland and Malta, there's no other country that uses it for electing their main House of Parliament. The only other case is Australia that elects its Senate. But in all other cases, if it's a PR system, it's some variant of list that tends to be used.
I think we see a lot in proportional representational systems that you do have this diversity of parties, these smaller parties that have access to the political system to kind of have their electoral chances. And whereas we see in majoritarian democracies, often we have this two-party system that emerges. How is Ireland a case where you have almost a duopoly between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael as two of the parties that kind of emerged? Does it relate to our electoral system, or maybe is that an affect of our social dynamics, do you think?
I mean, it's a great question, and I don't think anyone knows for sure, but there's no doubt up to, let's say, about the 1980s, even into the 90s, the system was, my late father coined the phrase, he borrowed from Jean Blondel, it was a two and a half party system. So we had Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and the tiny little Labour Party, Social Democratic Party. And it's only from the late 80s really onwards and gradually and then quite quickly in the more recent elections have we sort of more converted to a proportional, to a multi-party system. But it still remains, and that's in your question, a very unusual multi-party system because it was a duopoly. It's now I don't know what you call it, a triopoly. I don't know what the correct term is. But we got three parties now of the same size, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Sinn Féin, each getting about, 25%. And then the rest is all swept up by tiny parties and independents. And so the question then is, where does the electoral system feature here? And I think probably the main reason why the electoral system's impact on the party system has tended overall to be relatively weak compared to other proportional systems in that it hasn't provoked multi-partyism. I think it relates to the fact that our constituencies, our districts are always very small. We have the smallest district magnitude of any European democracy. Our average district magnitude is less than 5. Whereas in most other proportional systems, you may have some small districts, but you'll have much larger districts. And as you know, the smaller your district magnitude, the less proportional your system. So what we tend to find, many analysts will refer to Ireland's version of single transferable vote as being somewhat semi-proportional.
Okay, that's very interesting. I'm wondering then, when you say there is this shift in recent years, what may have kind of propelled this shift forward? I mean, we see one of the kind of milestones in the shift of Irish political systems as being the 2008 financial crisis, kind of shaking up the party system there. But you mentioned even into the late 90s, early 2000s, that you start to see more of a shift away from this duopoly. What is going on there?
Yeah, it's such a great line of questioning. I mean, Connor Little and I tried to explore some of this because in the party politics literature, there's a question mark over when do you describe a party system as having changed. Now, I don't remember the exact details of our argument, but basically we were name checking very heavily Peter Mayer's work, as always happens when you talk about party politics. Eventually, you go back to the great Peter Mayer. And Peter Mayer was talking about that moment when the PDs, the Progressive Democrats, break through and Fianna cross the Rubicon and form their first coalition. That's the sort of moment where you might time the start of the change of the party system. And if I remember in the paper with Connor, we sort of tried to track developments since then. And it's sort of a Hemingway kind of story, it happens slowly and then happens very quickly. So it's sort of bit by bit, election after election, the duopoly starts to crumble. And Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael's average votes just decline pretty steadily until the crash. And then with the crash, all bets are off. Fianna Fáil go really down low. Fine Gael hold their own, and then Fine Gael go down low. And now both parties no longer can claim ownership of the party system in the way that they used to. So there's no doubt that after the economic crash, we definitely have had electoral change. But the electoral change was coming. It was already starting, going back to Peter Mayer's argument. And so if we're trying to understand why multi-partyism started to creep into the system, in that sense, the Irish story is a very familiar story. It's just electoral change. The phenomenon of electoral change that really starts to affect all of the world's democracies from about the 90s was starting to affect us too.
Yeah. And I think we see also in a lot of European democracies that this left-right cleavage kind of characterized a lot of the 20th century politics. Whereas in Ireland, throughout the 20th century, we had obviously two quite similar parties, ideologically speaking, hold most of the vote share. Where is that difference coming from as well? Why don't we see this sort of left-right cleavage in Irish politics throughout the 20th century?
Yeah, and then, that was the big debate when I was a student, an undergraduate student in the 70s and 80s. And you had the work of John White and my father and Peter Mayer and Tom Garvin and many others who were all puzzling over this phenomenon. And I think it was and Richard Sinnott. It was probably best encapsulated by Richard Sinnott and John White's work, where they were sort of making the argument. John White was the one who first said Lipset and Rockland just doesn't fit. None of the four cleavages fit the Irish case. And it all came to the coincidence between the moment of democratisation in Ireland coinciding with the moment of independence, and the latter distracted the former. And for reasons that John White sets out, as I'm sure you know, none of the four cleavages seemed to fit. Sinnott came in then with another piece that seemed to suggest that the centre-periphery cleavage sort of fitted because it was the periphery breaking from the centre and then the periphery dividing over the Civil War into two different peripheral parties. And so you could sort of find a version of Lipset and Rockland, but ultimately the most significant cleavage, the class cleavage, never seemed to fit. It was politics without social basis, to use John White's phrase. And as electoral change has started to creep in, that's where we've begun to see the emergence of a sort of class cleavage. And in the most recent elections, as you know, you can see a distinctive left versus right, particularly between Fine Gael and Sinn Féin, between those two extremes. So I think that's where it begins to happen. One other point I'll make on it is in the paper with Connor, we sort of tried to develop an argument that Reuven Hazan made in some of his early work about the significance of centre parties. because one of the unusual traits about Ireland, and again, I don't remember everything that Connor and I wrote here, but one of the unusual traits is that for much of our period, with the period of the duopoly, to go back to your first phrasing of it, um, we were really unusual in having two centre parties. I mean, I know there's a debate about just how centrist these two parties are, but internationally, and look at the recent work by Owen O'Malley and how Ireland voted, they are pretty damn centrist. And so,
Hmm.
I always get my centrifugals and centripetals confused, but the usual phenomenon is the centre is weak from Duverger onwards, and politics goes out to the fringes, and so you get your left and versus right. That's the way that the gravity works in electoral politics. Whereas potentially you could argue that because we had these two strong centre parties, the gravitational pull was inward. And that could also be part of the explanation. They were sweeping up the votes that didn't have anywhere else to go except towards the centre. As that duopoly's support has crumbled, that gravitational pull is now changing.
Yeah, because we do start to see more of this new cleavages emerging in Irish politics over the last decade or two. And I think one of those comes in the area that's most relevant to what I was working on at the moment, which is housing. And we see after the financial crisis, the housing crisis kind of emerging as a core kind of political issue. So, in your opinion, or in your view, has housing kind of shaped the electoral politics over the last 2 decades, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think housing is part of for me, I would conceive of it as part of a bigger story. And it's a story of those for whom the system is seen not to look after their interests. So the system is not
Hmm.
working for them. And I think that it's those sort of seeds that explain the phenomenon of Trump and the phenomenon of right wing populism the world over. So it's the post industrial kind of theme that you see play out in most other cases. But since we sort of skipped the industrial phase, we kind of skipped that kind of phenomenon. But the Irish variant of it is, which coteries of the population have good reason to feel that the system isn't working for them. And housing, I think, is a good bellwether of that in the Irish case. But it wouldn't just be housing. I think it would be the quality of the health service, infrastructural delays. It would be, the fact that we are a wealthy country and yet there's massive inequality and huge swathes of the population who just feel that things aren't working for them. And it's in that sort of context that we have the potential emergence of the far right, like we're seeing elsewhere.
Hmm. Yeah, that's definitely. We do see that the far right is slowly but surely growing in Ireland, but they haven't really had this electoral breakthrough just yet. Really, with any major parties kind of holding far right views, we have seen, I think, maybe since the financial crash, maybe most explicitly in the 2020 election, kind of this uh, far left, populist left, kind of showing up as the key competitor to the centrist or centre right kind of duopoly as we were talking about before. Do you think that that kind of demonstrates the emergence of the class cleavages in society then through these key issues, as you say, the health service kind of issues and also the housing crisis and more issues that exacerbate that class divide?
I think that there's a lot in what you just framed in your question that I would agree with. I mean, I wouldn't rule out the cultural divide emerging. I think we're beginning to see the seeds of that as well, not least in,
Hmm.
in the way in which immigration has suddenly become quite a hot topic in the party political ping pong, even if
Hmm.
it isn't so much reflected yet in the polls, thank goodness. I mean, why haven't we seen the emergence of these new parties? There's all sorts of reasons, and I know you know a lot of this. I mean, there's the old Owen O'Malley et al. Argument about the role that Sinn Féin has played in occupying the space as self-portrayed left populist party. That sort of has kept the market closed, a market that no longer is so closed. We saw that before the last election, that they bled a lot of that support. There's good work by Rory Costello that I think demonstrates that using Ned's data very well. That is that people who were of an anti-immigrant hue, who were voting for Sinn Féin for all sorts of other reasons, drifted away from the party quite dramatically and don't seem to be going back. There's that sort of argument. But there is another
Hmm.
argument that gets back to the electoral system where we started, or the electoral process more generally in Ireland. And I don't think this should be underestimated. There's a paper Sean Bowler and I wrote in the book on the Conservative Revolution, the electoral study relating to the 2011 election, where we muse over why in the heat of that crash, you know, the meltdown of Fianna Fáil and the Greens disappearing altogether for that period, why no new party emerged? And as you know, there were some attempts by some actors to create a new party. And in it, we just show that it's an argument that Liam Weeks has been making for ages. The independence, the other unique feature of Irish politics, the phenomenon of independence, the fact that we have more independence in our parliament than all the other parliaments of Europe combined, as a pressure valve. But it's more than that. You know, it's so easy to get nominated to run as a candidate.
Hmm.
The funding model that we have, the generous funding model, includes independents, so they receive state funding as well. The difficulty of trying to coordinate across constituencies versus being a lone entrepreneur, running as an independent and winning very easily because you only need to get, you know, a certain proportion of the quota to get elected. And there's much more than that. But I think that that in itself is one reason perhaps why we haven't seen that breakthrough. The others, like the lack of a enterprising Nigel Farage kind of person, is certainly not to be ruled out. But I would talk about the electoral system, electoral laws, and I would see that as a feature too.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I think to kind of look at one of the other areas that I was looking at the moment is this kind of age divide in politics. That I'm not sure there's been a whole lot of research done on Irish politics so far, and maybe not just to my knowledge about the age divides specifically. But I'm wondering, do you see this also kind of emerging, or has there always been kind of this age divide in younger people might vote differently than older people? I mean, we do have some maybe colloquial assumptions that people become more conservative with age and that younger people might be more likely to vote more radically. Some of that's kind of been obviously disputed in the literature. But do you see in Irish politics a bit of an age divide anywhere?
Well, we know there is. I mean, I know what you're getting at in your question. I mean, in the absence of long-term longitudinal data, it's very hard to really test out whether there's a cohort effect or a generational effect or whatever the term is in the Irish case. But now with the NEDS data, this is something that will be fixed in the future. But we know from looking at just at the cross-sectional data in the recent elections, you know, you just look at the simple crosstabs by age, and there's absolutely no doubt that the younger voters are fleeing from Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Labour. So the old two and a half parties have really suffered from a loss of younger voters, whether that's long term or whether that's a short term phenomenon. As I said, we don't really know enough yet to be able to say. And where they're going up to now has been to other left parties and particularly to Sinn Féin. And I think from memory, that's a pretty consistent pattern, at least in the last two, if not the last three elections. That's not that unusual. I mean, the phenomenon of, you know, younger citizens having different ways of engaging with the political system is another one of these bigger debates. There's good work there's good work on whether or not this helps to explain declining turnout and whether votes at 16 might fix it. There's good research on whether it explains part of the reason why party attachments are going down, and again, whether this is a phenomenon that is just going to continue with each successive generation. So I don't know enough in detail because I haven't done enough research on that area myself. I know that's more Rory Costello's work, but I would hazard the argument that whatever trends you might find in your research internationally, Ireland would probably fit that quite well, would be my guess.
Yeah, because I think in sort of the research I was doing, there's a lot of competing arguments about why young people might vote differently, and also which effects are in this generational cohort kind of group of effects, and which effects are more related to the life cycle and aging process as well. And one of the areas where we find consensus is that people do become more aligned with their parties as they age. So this partisanship does become a stronger influence on people's voting behavior as they get older. So would you think that maybe younger people would be more likely then, if they don't have this kind of crystallized party preferences, that they're more likely to switch parties easier when they're younger, and also maybe more likely to move away from the likes of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and Labour because they haven't formed those partisan preferences as much as older people would have.
It's a difficult one. I mean, because I know there's some debate in the party ID literature about whether the phenomenon of declining party attachment is continuously ongoing or whether it might have plateaued in recent years. And from memory, I think some of the recent work in Ireland, at least for the last election, seemed to suggest there was some sort of plateauing. So there's that sort of dimension, which for me creates some uncertainty. I guess the other one, and perhaps this would be part of an Irish story, is the fact of the dramatic decline in the support for that duopoly means I'm wondering whether there might be a sort of habit forming kind of argument, and maybe there is a debate about that I'm not aware of. But if if you happen to be a younger voter who is coming of age in a household where the sort of anti Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael sentiment has reached a certain height, so that now that kind of breaks that link that supposedly is created by the party ID argument that you vote for the way your parents voted.
Hmm.
It could be that we're talking about a cliff edge kind of phenomenon here, and that these younger citizens don't revert back to those older established parties, but they continue to look for new areas. But I don't know how one would be able to develop an argument like that.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to kind of investigate those effects because there is that aging effect of, partisanship potentially getting stronger as you age, but also the generational effect of, in general, it looks like society is voting less based on their partisan ID and more based on maybe issue areas or more based on other factors. I'm interested to hear your opinion on if Irish society does show particularly strong party loyalties, maybe not in the youngest generation, but in older generations who did kind of stick along the lines of Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael or Labour. Was that maybe quite a strong example of partisan loyalty in Ireland when we compare it to other countries?
My memory of that was that we didn't stand out in any particular way. That in the levels of party attachment and the declining trend was, from my understanding, was more or less on par with elsewhere. But I could be wrong on that. I don't think it was particularly strong. But of course, we're framing it in terms of that particular, theoretical proposition that it's party attachment that's driving it. There could be other things that drive these processes, and maybe
Yeah.
framing it in a different way might produce a different view.
Yeah. I think it is difficult to try and delineate just one effect from one specific area, whether it be party alignment or issue salience or something like that as well. I was doing a little bit of research into the kind of retrospective evaluation of incumbents when it comes to elections as well. And kind of one of the things I came across is the idea that perhaps your partisanship bias would cloud your evaluation of incumbents. And if we do see that older generations in Ireland might potentially have more of a partisanship bias than younger people would, do you think that older people may potentially have less of an ability to critically evaluate incumbents, especially if they align with their partisanship bias?
I wonder how that would be done in an Irish context in a way that it
Hmm.
might be done elsewhere. Some of my uncertainty about it relates back again to the electoral system question, or at least the argument that's commonly made that our peculiar electoral system promotes a politics of localism. And as you know, in every election study, there's always a question about what is the reason you voted. The three offerings are your local constituency politician, the party leader, and I can't remember, maybe the party manifesto or some version of that, the policies of the party. And it's that first one that historically always features very strongly, dipped a bit more of late, and it's never going to be a perfect measure. But it does then lead to a question mark over whether the retrospective voting is as much about whether somebody fixed your drains or got you the passport ahead of everyone else, or whether you like the policies of the party. So there'd be that dimension. And I suppose the other dimension is the fact that we now are dealing with coalitions, whereas
Hmm.
before the 1980s, the majority of the governments were single party majority or minority governments, where you could theoretically, at least as a voter, really hold the party to account in terms of the extent to which it actually implemented the policies they had promised, versus the situation under coalition situation where compromises are made, and who do you blame if you don't think they've actually implemented policies as you wanted. So it kind of muddies things a bit.
So yeah, I definitely agree with that, and there is some interesting literature because when we look at retrospective voting, a lot of the classic literature is based in these majoritarian democracies as well, where you do have clear kind of assignment of responsibility. Where in a coalition system, it is quite difficult, and there is kind of confusions there whether you would see that it's the major party like the coalition leader that would get most of the accountability, or what we have seen a lot in Irish politics is the likes of the smallest party in the coalition gets punished electorally, they'll drop out almost electorally from the map. Is that a key difference in Ireland, or is that something we might see in other countries as well, where the smallest coalition member might, uh, you know, bear most of the brunt of the electoral punishment?
Again, this is something that Connor Little and I have looked at it a little, if I remember, in the past. I think the phenomenon of the small party getting punished is a particular case. We know of it in Ireland, and there's plenty of evidence of it with all of the small parties being in government have never done so well. I don't know enough about whether we stand out differently in that regard. And I'm guessing part of the issue that might make it difficult to know for certain is that maybe we also have an unusual makeup of our coalition governments that relating to that duopoly thing. There's always one or other of the big parties that's the big beast, and then it's one or maybe two at most small parties in the mix. Whereas I'm going to
Hmm.
guess that in across other European democracies, you might have a slightly more even balance, sort of large-ish versus smallish, which is kind of where we're going.
Yeah. I think one of the last areas, and it goes back to the area that I was looking into. To be fair, my findings in this haven't been so clear either, but I'm wondering to what extent has the government's housing policies over the last 20 years resulted in lower vote share, or actually, as we have seen, they've been able to retain quite a lot of vote share. Do you think that it's something that younger people and older people might have different views on the housing crisis, and that they're more likely to either support government policy on that or not based on their age? Or do you think maybe age isn't as important a factor on that?
I'd say age would be important, but I've sort of had in my head the sort of social desirability type of issue that you ask somebody a question and they give the answer that they think they should give. And
Hmm.
I would wonder if housing is something that you can easily tap to get an accurate representation of whether younger citizens really feel that the system isn't working for them compared to older people. Because, there's going to be a grandparent effect, I suppose, or even a parent effect, or just a simple altruistic sense of as a citizen living in our own home. Surely everyone should have that right. And so it gets a slightly inaccurate measure of really the true feeling. And I would wonder whether I don't know if the NEDS data allows this, but whether another way to try and get at that is to try and think of some proxy measures um, along, the system isn't working for me. There are things about the system that, the criticisms of
Hmm.
politics, some of the system with maybe some controlling for whether you have house ownership or your generation or things like that. And just to see if
Hmm.
some sort of patterning there.
Yeah, no, that's quite interesting. I mean, yeah, the NEDS data is quite a rich data set, and there's a lot you can do with it. So I've been just trying to muddle my way through it to get some sort of results out of that, which I find interesting nonetheless. I think that was super interesting kind of discussion, and thanks so much for coming on and let me interview you.
More than welcome, Adam. It was a pleasure.